today's world of satellite mapping, data sharing, and high-speed internet, anyone with a phone or computer can view any part of this beautiful planet up close and in intricate detail. No need to leave the home to travel the world today. But some of us choose to do it the old-fashioned way, like I was doing one sunny morning in April. And by an astonishing coincidence, as I was out there doing a video on exploring, the machines in the sky were exploring me. That's my trailer with the black strip of solar panels in the back, and that's my white Jeep. But where was I? It was Monday, April 15th, 2019, when I first pulled into that camp and set up the trailer. I had just arrived in Tennessee from the south and was most likely taking a walk on the Natchez Trace the morning the satellite passed overhead. Checking my footage later on, I recall being at the foot of a monument at the time about a mile away. Sure enough, zooming in on that spot, here I am, and this is the video I was filming. So here is the monument to Meriwether Lewis, where he met his untimely fate on October 11th, 1809. But it's not the end of the story, this is just the beginning. I really love the wilderness. I love travel, I love camping, and it gives me that sense of adventure, even though it's only a personal sense of adventure. But I also admire the early explorers, like Lewis and Clark, who came out on unknown lands, to them at least, with undaunted courage, and documented it and shared it with the rest of the world. Now there is a contradiction there, of course, because they didn't really discover anything. It was already discovered thousands of years ago by the people that actually lived here. And that was the indigenous people, the First Nations, or as some like to call, the North American Indians. And the beginning of my story is near Hohenwald, Tennessee, at the Meriwether Lewis Historic Site, which is a campground and burial site honoring the famed explorer. It's a rather sad memorial, as the inscription ends with the line, "His melancholy death occurred where this monument now stands, and under which rest his mortal remains." Standing nearby is a little log cabin called the Grinder House. Well, it's certainly true. The career of Meriwether Lewis as an explorer ground to a halt in this grinder house, but his legacy is unsurpassed. I don't think there's a school kid anywhere in the U.S. that hasn't heard of these two men, William Clark and Meriwether Lewis. And if you've traveled anywhere west of the Mississippi to the northern states, chances are you've seen this roadside sign along the way. My desire was to retrace across America the route Lewis and Clark traveled to the Pacific and back. But since I didn't have a boat or canoe, my Jeep and camper would have to suffice, and with rubber hitting pavement and gravel, I circumvented the route along the highways of America. I had already featured this in prior videos, including Floods, Explorers, and a Wonder Dog, where I started following the Missouri and St. Louis and ended up east of Kansas City. This is the spot in 1804 when Lewis and Clark started traveling up the Missouri to explore the West. But being more of a camper than a historian, I'd like to show you a few camp spots I found along the way. In my Lewis, Clark, and Slim video, I ventured through Kansas, Iowa, and Nebraska until I reached South Dakota. It's a little bit wider, a lot deeper, and a lot filthier. So the object of the Lewis and Clark expedition was to explore the Missouri River and carry on right to the Pacific. thereby finding the best water route across the continent. As it was also a voyage of discovery, it must be journaled, mapped, and measured by scientific means. In other words, the world's first adventure documentary. Now I continue through North Dakota and the place where the expedition wintered, Mandan. Today's town of Chamberlain is the home of a beautiful sculpture named Dignity. That depicts an Aboriginal woman bringing beauty and promise to this sacred land. It also has a marker to commemorate the Lewis and Clark bicentennial, as in 1804 the explorers passed by on their way up the Missouri. And it was near this spot where Lewis and Clark first encountered the Sioux on September 28, 1804, a meeting that almost proved disastrous. But on a brighter note, the Corps of Discovery were now experiencing major changes in the landscape and wildlife, as they were now in the middle of the Great Plains. A vast grassland that whistled. Although some animals were familiar, others were not. The men were so fascinated with the squeaky little prairie dogs that they actually caught one, kept it alive, and the next spring sent it back to Thomas Jefferson. Although Captain Lewis was already familiar with buffalo, or plains bison as they are actually called, all the men were in awe of how immense the herds were that roamed the plains. In a single count, 3,000 of these massive beasts were observed. By October, as the geese started to fly south, the Corps knew they had to winter soon and proceeded to find a suitable location. By late October, they began to spot Indian villages on the upper banks. These were the homes of the Mandan people. The expedition then moored ashore to have counsel with the chiefs, especially one who was called Saheka, whom Lewis and Clark referred to as Big White. Unlike the Sioux, the Mandans were friendly due to past experiences with Canadian fur traders. After careful negotiations and trading goods, the expedition was allowed to winter across the river. They proceeded to build a fort known today as Fort Mandan. The fort was reclaimed by the Missouri ages ago, but there are still markers to show the location. Washburn has its own Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center, but at the time of my visit, it was closed. While the natives had Spanish horses, Meriwether Lewis only had one domestic animal, a dog named Seaman. Perhaps to symbolize this newfound land, Seaman accompanied the whole expedition without being eaten. There's a bronze statue of him at Fort Mandan. Back in 1804, the bison could be seen fattening up as the days got shorter. When winter finally did arrive, it was the coldest season any of the expedition had ever experienced. The Missouri froze on December 2nd, and by December 12th, the temperature had dropped to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Most days the men huddled inside by the fire, bearing the elements only for hunting. In contrast, I had it pretty easy 215 years later, cleaning the windshield on a Wyoming morning. By spring, the melt had started, and soon the men would be moving on. But before proceeding westward, they took on a new crew member. Toussaint Charbonneau was a French-Canadian fur trapper who had been living with the Mandan. Described by Lewis as a man of no particular merit, he also had an unhealthy passion for young native girls. He did, however, have two positive merits. First, he claimed he could speak several native dialects, and the second is one of his two native wives would accompany him. That wife was a 16-year-old Shoshone girl named Sacagawea. Her life was legendary. Having been kidnapped by a rival tribe at only 12 years old, she was sold to Charbonneau in a possible gambling bet. In February 1805, she gave birth to a boy, and that baby was on her back when she set off with the explorers 2 months later. She would later be hailed as one of the greatest assets of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Unfortunately, I was not able to retrace the whole Lewis and Clark route as they headed west from Mandan, but I did manage to tent camp by the Missouri near the James Kipp recreational area in 2017, part of the Missouri Breaks. Unfortunately, in this sparsely populated area today, most of the shores are now on private land. But at least I got to experience how peaceful and stunningly beautiful this part of the river is. As you continue to head west, 3 changes are of note. First, the Rocky Mountains now loom in the distance. Herds of pronghorn antelope appear, and the air is unmistakably dry. The Montana grasslands of today have been tamed, the soil tilled and irrigated, and the bisons replaced with nodding donkeys. The Missouri seems calm and peaceful as you approach the city of Great Falls, Montana. Living in Alberta, I always wondered why they named it Great Falls, as I couldn't see one. To find the answer, I visited the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center at Giant Springs State Park. Inside, I found many displays and exhibits representing the cultural and historic aspects of the native tribes of the area. And as its name suggests, it was also a wealth of knowledge on the Lewis and Clark expedition. This display of the men portaging a hill gave me insight as to how difficult it was, but it was one photograph that explained it all. This is what the Great Falls looked like in the time of Lewis and Clark, a raging mass of water the explorers had to overcome. So why did this mighty river seem so calm and tranquil today? Well, let's just say it wasn't God or Mother Nature that eventually changed the past, but rather the hands of men. For even the thundering spectacle of a natural torrent has now been tamed. Dams, bridges, and roads have made a portage that took the Lewis and Clark expedition weeks to conquer, can now be done in an hour. But as much as these brave men suffered, I too had my challenges. Like battling a gauntlet of trucks and large RVs on the interstates. Scary stuff, right? One thing I admired about Meriwether Lewis was his willingness to experiment. He had an iron boat frame constructed back east to help portage across the Rocky Mountains. The theory was that animal hides could be lashed across the frame to make an instant canoe. Great idea, right? Sorry, Mary, but it failed, as it leaked and then sunk. Good try, though. As for me, I also had a failure on my travels. On September 17th, 2019, I was camped on the Missouri near Helena, Montana, to shoot for this video. I had been experimenting with a wind turbine I'd attached to my camper when a nasty windstorm rolled in right at dusk. Now you'd think that having wind for a wind turbine would be a good thing, but it wasn't. It's not generating a lot. It's more than it's just a trickle charge. But at least I know it's generating something. Well, if you listen closely, you hear the sound of the wind. It's about 20 miles per hour consistently right now. And if you look at the lake behind me, you'll see the white caps. The turbine's going like crazy, and it's not giving me a warm and fuzzy feeling. Yeah, high winds typically make people uncomfortable anyway, but to have this 40-pound thing twirling above your head, that doesn't give me a lot of, it doesn't make me feel good, let's put it that way. And I'm thinking the amount of wind I need to generate to make this turbine work is not something you'd want to be camping in. I'm going to carry on with the experiment, but it's kind of making me nervous. We'll see where it goes, I don't know. As the gale force winds increased, I was completely underwhelmed at how little power it was actually producing. However, the wind's terrible now. It's about 30-40 miles an hour, and it's hitting the side of my trailer. I'm worried the roof's gonna come off because I've got bungee cords holding it on. I gotta get out of here. This is crazy. Oh my God. That's crazy. I'm towing the trailer. But I have to find somewhere with more shelter. I can't be out in an exposed area like that. Oh my God. The next morning, I came out to assess the situation. Well, it's a shame, but I've got to stop the wind experiment right now. It got very windy last night, and I was worried that it was going to rip off the roof of my trailer. So I'm putting a stop to it now, taking it down until I can get proper support for the A-frame inside. I can't have the supports like that. So hopefully I'll continue it again later on, but safety has to be the first priority. I never did go back to the wind experiment, for solar was far more efficient and immensely more safe. As the expedition carried on, they now approached the mountains. It was July 19th, 1805, when the men first entered the Rockies. Although a very impressive landmark, Lewis felt the opposite. In his notes, he writes, "Every object here wears a dark and glooming aspect," perhaps realizing the challenges that lie ahead. As for me, I also had a challenge at my Montana campsite near Canyon Ferry. Well, it's only day 2 into the trip, and I've had my first casualty. My kettle. Handle broke off. But fortunately, I always carry my trusty drill and my trusty rivet gun. Already drilled it. Line her up. Don't have to miss coffee. We're back in biz. I was just south of Townsend, Montana, and just a couple of miles out of town was a Lewis and Clark point of interest. The Missouri waters here are calm and perfect for boating, and the view inspiring enough for artists. But in 1805, it was a spot on a map that carried a certain significance. I think anybody that knows about the Lewis and Clark expedition knows about the two key players, and that was Captain Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. But there was over 30 men that completed the entire expedition. There is one man that stood out in many ways, and that was York. York was William Clark's slave, and although he accompanied the entire expedition, he never got paid for it. And when the expedition was completed, he wasn't released, actually, until quite a few years after that. But at least here, in this group of islands behind me, he gets some credit, because they're called York's Islands, after York. Just east of where Highway 287 meets the I-90 is an important Lewis and Clark location, the Missouri headwaters. So here are the headwaters of the Missouri. This area is actually called Three Forks. There's really only two, because the Gallatin River is a little downstream. And it's fortunate because I only have two forks. So the two forks here are the Madison and the Jefferson. For the first time since leaving St. Louis 15 months ago, the Corps would be leaving the Missouri and following its tributaries. And although the Madison seems the stronger current, it was the Jefferson that headed west towards the mountains. Well, making it to the headwaters of the Missouri River was a pretty big accomplishment for the Lewis and Clark expedition. However, they weren't done yet, as they carried on up the Jefferson. And in reality, they had it pretty easy up to this point, but as they kept going west, it got a lot more difficult. In reading Clark's notes on July 25th, he mentions proceeding to the Three Forks and finding evidence of horse tracks in the area. This was a critical find, as the crew were in desperate need of horses for the overland journey over the mountains. But unfortunately, Clark was in serious pain at the time. Although every bush seemed to tear at the men's clothing, it was the never-ending carpet of prickly pear cactus that had tore up their feet. Clark had it the worst and needed a rest to heal. On July 27, 1805, they headed south on the Jefferson, named fittingly by the president who commissioned the Corps of Discovery. On an interesting side note, as the Jefferson cuts through the foothills of the mountains, it takes you to the Lewis and Clark Cavern State Park and Campground, which is about 19 miles west of Three Forks. Although Lewis and Clark did not discover these caves, it's an interesting place to explore, and I did do a video on it. Now, the route the Lewis and Clark expedition took over the Great Divide was an area now called Lemhi Pass. Today there is a dirt road to that same crossing, as long as you're brave enough to try it. I left the trailer back at camp and proceeded with the Jeep. There's no way I would attempt a road like this with a camper behind, as there's no opportunity to turn around, and if you start to slide, it would pull you backward and right off a cliff. Well, I made it up one side at least. And there's a toilet nearby in case you need to empty your trousers. By the way, if you don't believe my warning, read the sign. No buses, RVs, or towing units over 26 feet long. The clouds were so close you could almost touch them. And the view back where I had just come from was amazing. Near the pass was a little picnic area where I believe you could pitch a tent. But my interest was in the dedication to a very special person. It was Sacagawea that guided them to her homeland and did so much more. You know, this is such an important point in the history of the Lewis and Clark expedition, because this is where they finally came across the Shoshone tribe and the Shoshone chief, and right up front was Sacagawea. And she played a pivotal role in this. On so many levels. As an interpreter, as she knew the language because it was her homeland. And by some strange coincidence, the chief they were actually negotiating with was her brother. So it was a very emotional time for Sacagawea and the group itself, because now they had hope for continuing to the west. And some kind of wonder, why didn't Sacagawea just go back with her tribe here and leave the expedition? And many think, well, because she wasn't a free woman. She wasn't able to make her own choices. The men in her life made those choices for her. Or maybe she had a sense of adventure and she really wanted to see the expedition make it to the west coast, and she wanted to see it as well. The truth, of course, is lost to history. But there's another sign in the area that certainly has some merit to it. The one that claims the beginnings of the endless Missouri. This tiny little spring is the true source of the Missouri River. It's coming down from Lemhi Pass. And I'm going to do something I'd never do at the Missouri River in St. Louis. Oh, that's nice and cold. Hopefully no E. coli in there. Well, this is the end of my Missouri travels. However, there's still a mountain pass to venture over. Looking east is the way I came, and looking west is where I'm heading. When Lewis and Clark saw this view, I'm sure there were mixed emotions, as the path to the Pacific would not be an easy one. But through sheer will and determination, the Cora Discovery carried on. As for me, I just hopped into my Jeep and drove on, as my journey wasn't over either. I hope you enjoyed this video and will stay with me for the final chapter as I follow the explorers to the Pacific and beyond.